Class, welcome to day one of Listen and Learn. Online today, we'll be learning about the U.S. Civil War. Our first story is about Harriet Tubman. Our first vocabulary we have plantations, a large farm where crops are raised. There were many large cotton plantations in the South before the Civil War. Second word, slavery. The practice of forcing people to work without pay as enslaved people and denying them the freedom to decide how to live their lives. Slavery was seen by many as unfair since all people should have the right to be paid for their work and be free to decide where to work and live. Our next word is survival. Survival is the state of continuing to exist, especially in spite of difficult conditions. A polar bear relies on its layer of fur for its survival in very cold habitats. Our next word is value, usefulness or importance. Jorge's father always stressed the value of getting a good education. And our last word is wages. Wages is the money that is paid or received for work. Enslaved people were forced to do difficult work for no wages. For the next few weeks, you will learn about the different parts of the country that strongly disagreed with slavery as the United States grew and spread westward. Slavery was allowed in some states, but not in others, having different parts of the United States disagree about whether or not slavery should be allowed, eventually led to war. This war was called the U.S. Civil War, or the War Between the States. A civil war is a war between two different groups within the same country. We will learn about the important events and people related to the Civil War. Today's read aloud is about a woman named Harriet Tubman, also called Minty as a child. Minty was her nickname. Harriet Tubman lived and worked before, during, and after the time of the Civil War. Today we're going to listen carefully to learn what Harriet Tubman's life was like as a child before the U.S. Civil War. Minty's eyelids were heavy. Her head bobbed up and down as she faded in and out of sleep. She pinched herself to try to stay awake, but the house was so quiet and calm. Even the tree frogs, crickets, and other creatures of the night had stopped chirping and croaking. It seemed all of Maryland was asleep at this late hour, except young Minty. At age 6, Minty should have been asleep too. Her body mind cried out for sleep, yet she dared not doze off for fear she would not hear the baby crying. This baby was Minty's responsibility. She watched over the baby day and night, rocked him to sleep, kept him warm in his blanket, and sang songs to keep him happy. Minty would do anything in her power to keep him happy, for she knew that if he cried, she would be punished. And so, each time the baby stirred in his crib, each time he whimpered or moaned, Minty's heart raced. As soon as the baby cried out, even if he only cried for a moment, the baby's mother would get very angry with Minty. This was the awful, painful reality in which Minty lived, because Minty was an enslaved African person. Even at the tender age of 6 years old, she was forced to work for no pay all day long, every day, and Minty thought she would be enslaved her entire life until she died. This was the terrible truth of slavery. Minty and other enslaved Africans like her had no rights or freedom. Minty would be forced to do hard work given to her from sunup to sundown, providing great value to the plantation owner almost every day of her entire life. Very, very little of Minty's time would ever be her own to do with as she wished. This is what life was like for millions of people in the United States of America when Minty was 6. In fact, this is what life had been like for many people for a long time, long before Minty or her parents and her grandparents were born. One night, Minty asked her mom how and why her family had become enslaved. Well, your grandmother, her mother told her, she came over the ocean on a great big ship. She came from a place called Africa. Many Africans are here now, enslaved in this land they call the United States. Why did grandmother and other Africans come here? Minty asked. It was not their choice to come here from Africa, her mother explained. Africans were captured by men with guns and other weapons who wanted to bring them to America to work in slavery. They were put on these ships against their will, and they were brought to this country and sent to places like plantation, farms, businesses, or households to work. That's why our life is the way it is. We do as we are told, and we do our best to survive. But this, Minty's mother meant, they worked hard. By this, Minty's mother meant they worked hard to keep their families as safe and healthy as possible. Minty's father and mother had 9 children, including Minty, but like most enslaved Africans, the family did not live or work together all in one home. Minty's mother worked for a man named Edward Brodess. Minty's father worked for a man named Edward Thompson, whose plantation was down the road from the Brodesses' home. 3 of Minty's sisters were sent away to work for plantation owners in Georgia. Minty never saw any of them again. As her mother said, enslaved people did not have the choice or say in the matter. The plantation owners did whatever they had to do to make as much money as possible from their plantations and slave labor. Because Minty's families of enslaved Africans often could not live together or were separated, they depended on the community of enslaved Africans on the plantation. Mothers and fathers would take care of children who were not their own. Enslaved Africans helped and supported each other as communities by looking out for each other and working together. In this way, they could be strong together, despite the fact that they were enslaved. Although life was hard for the enslaved people, this working together and helping each other contributed to their survival and made it better. Where Minty lived, the enslaved Africans worked hard to perform many jobs that added value to the plantation. They took care of the horses and tended to the crops, corn, and hay, plowing, planting, and harvesting. In the winter, they chopped wood, mended fences, and helped clear more land for farming. Many enslaved people were skilled at a trade. Some tended to the farm animals, and butchers preserved the meat. Weavers, spinners, and seamstresses were involved in the process of making clothing. Their skills were valued. Skilled carpenters constructed and repaired buildings and made furniture, and blacksmiths used iron to make many important tools for the life and work of plantation. Many lived in shacks with dirt floors, had one set of tattered clothes and no shoes, and didn't have enough to eat. Most enslaved Africans worked out in the fields, performing the many difficult tasks involved in growing and harvesting the crops. They were known as field slaves, and they lived the hardest lives of all. They worked from early morning until late at night, often with no relief from the heat or rest from their hard labor. They always worked under the watchful eye of the overseers, people who kept watch over and directed the enslaved people. The enslaved people always worked under the threat of punishment. Other enslaved Africans worked in what was known as the big house, the beautiful mansion belonging to the plantation owners. They did not have to work in the hot sun. They wore nicer clothes than the field slaves, and they sometimes had access to more food than the field slaves. In addition to the daily cooking and cleaning, house slaves helped make butter, wash the household laundry, and care for the plantation owners' young children. That was Minty's job, which was why she was watching the baby at night. Just like those who worked in the fields, enslaved Africans who worked in the house worked hard. But also, like the people who worked in the fields, they helped each other a lot, and this made it less hard and less sad. Plantations like the one where Minty and other enslaved Africans lived and worked were common throughout Maryland and all of the states in the southern United States. The South had rich soil and endless farmland. Those who owned the land could get rich by growing and selling tobacco, cotton, and other crops. Running a large plantation required many workers. There were no tractors or other machines to help in those days. The enslaved Africans working on plantations contributed valuable skills and labor to the success of the plantation. Without the enslaved Africans, the plantation could not be run. They did many important jobs of all kinds. Even so, rather than hiring workers and paying them, plantation owners who were white forced people who were black to work for free in a life of slavery. The plantation owners thought they could treat these African people this way because they looked different. Because of this difference in the way that they looked, the plantation owners thought they were better than the people they enslaved. As enslaved people, they were not given any wages for the work they did on the plantations. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to live in a life of slavery. And the children of the enslaved Africans, children like Minty and her sisters and brothers, automatically became enslaved the very moment they were born. They would likely remain enslaved until the day they died. As Minty's mother explained, enslaved people did not have the choice to be free people, or did they? Early on, Minty began to wonder whether it was possible to resist or fight back as an enslaved person. She wondered this because she had in fact seen her own mother resist the plantation owner's wishes. When Minty was young, Mr. Brodess arranged to send her brother Moses to a plantation belonging to another owner. Minty's mother had already seen 3 of her daughters sent far away to another plantation down the south, and she was determined not to lose any more of her children. When Mr. Brodess came to fetch Moses to send him away with the other plantation owner, Minty's mother stood in the doorway and promised, "I will not allow any more of my children to be taken away." Something in her eyes must have scared Mr. Brodess that day, because he turned around and he never tried to send Moses or anyone else in Minty's family away ever again. This event gave Minty a shred of hope. One day she might be able to fight back and possibly win her freedom. It is now time for our questions. Question 1. What was Harriet Tubman's nickname as a child? Minty was an enslaved person. What does that mean? Question 2. From which continent did many enslaved people come from? Question 3. What important responsibility did Minty have as a young enslaved African? Question 4. What types of work did enslaved Africans do in the field? What kind of work did enslaved Africans work at the big house do? And what other jobs did enslaved Africans perform on a plantation? Question 5. What was life like for an enslaved person? And question 6. Why were slaves like Minty and her family important to plantation owners in the South?